By the late 29th millennium, nearly 300 Terran centuries had passed since humanity first left the husk of Earth. The once thriving cradle of their kind had been stripped bare, its resources spent, its air thick with ruin. And so, with no choice but to look beyond their dying home, they set forth into the great unknown, toward the stars. What they found in those early days of the age of technology, none can now say. The records are lost, the truths swallowed by time. But whatever trials they faced, they overcame them. And in doing so, humanity spread like wildfire across the void. 1,000,000 worlds bore their mark. Some yielded untold treasures, others horrors beyond reckoning. At the peak of this forgotten era, humanity had made itself godlike. Science and art wove together in miracles. Planets sculpted in the image of lost Earth, stars tamed and bent to their will. Life itself shaped from clay and iron. Machines walked and thought and toiled in their service, bound by the hands that had created them. It was an age of mastery until it was not. At its height, in a moment that none foresaw, the dominion of humanity collapsed. Knowledge was lost, empire shattered, and in the chaos that followed, untold billions perished, their screams lost in the void, unanswered, unheard. The nightmare that followed would later be called the Age of Strife, or by some, Old Night. Warp storms, roiling and relentless, swept the galaxy, severing the stars from one another. Interstellar travel and communication became impossible. The Sol system, and with it old Earth, now called Terra, was cast adrift. So too were the colonies that had once thrived beneath the age of technology's rule. The storm's fury had been birthed in the long, slow death of the Eldari Empire and the coming of a new terrible god, Slaanesh. Terra itself became a battleground, not just against the tides of war, but against itself. Mars and Luna vied for dominance, while the last remnants of old Earth's once unified government shattered into feuding warlords and techno-barbarians. For 2,500 years, the world burned. The galaxy fared no better. Without guidance, without order, the great human colonies fell into ruin. Their supply lines were severed, their defenses crumbled, and anarchy took hold. Famine swept across worlds unprepared for self-sufficiency. Sanity unraveled. And worse, far worse, was the slow, creeping horror of the warp. Mankind had never truly understood the nature of the Imperium, nor the creatures that lurked beyond its veil. But on worlds where psychers had begun to manifest in great numbers, the boundaries between reality and nightmare thinned. The horrors that emerged could not be contained. Planets were swallowed whole, their populations erased in madness bloodshed. And yet, even that was not the end of humanity's suffering. The old empires had conquered many, but those they had crushed had not forgotten. In their weakness, the Xenos struck. Some came for revenge, others plunder. Hundreds of human star systems were razed, their people slaughtered, enslaved, or worse. Those who survived the onslaught soon lost what little remained: culture, history, knowledge, burned away in the desperate struggle to endure. By then, mankind teetered on the edge of extinction. The dead outnumbered the living. Few who remained stood alone, isolated, starving, ravaged by war and disease. The warp consumed what the aliens did not. Those who still had the luxury of thought saw no future beyond the slow decay into oblivion. No hope, no salvation. But they were wrong. Where once, upon Terra, there had been enlightenment, science, and art, there was now only savagery. And the cradle of mankind had turned into a battleground of endless bloodshed. Across the planet, warlords ruled through terror, their techno-barbarian hordes locked in ceaseless conflict. They wielded weapons of unspeakable power, chemical, biological, and thermonuclear, turning vast swaths of Terra into a scorched wasteland. What remained of civilization clung to existence within fortified holdfasts, surrounded by the ruins of forgotten ages. Between them, nomadic tribes wandered like ghosts, degenerate remnants of a lost golden era. The warlords were monstrous in both form and mind. Some were cybernetic nightmares, their flesh fused with cruel augmetics. Others, the so-called Butcher Kings and Vivisector warlords, ruled with blood-stained hands, their atrocities whispered in the dark. Religious zealots preached madness, raising armies in the name of false gods. Power shifted constantly. Empires rose and crumbled. Tyrants fell, only to be replaced by others just as brutal, if not worse. The names of some, like the Unspeakable King and the Seven Neverborn, would endure in terrified whispers long after their reigns had ended. In this age of war and horror, hope was a dying ember. And then, he came. In the 29th millennium, amid the chaos, a new warlord rose, one unlike any other. He had no equal, no peer. He did not seek power for its own sake, nor did he rule through superstition or brute force alone. He was the Emperor of mankind, and his arrival would change the course of history forever. For millennia, he had watched, waiting for the right moment. Now, as Terra stood at its lowest, he emerged, not as a mere conqueror, but as a force of reason and order. In his hands, he wielded not only unmatched might, but unparalleled knowledge, a mastery of science and warfare that no other could rival. At his command marched an army unlike any before it. The first soldiers of the Imperial Army, the precursors to the Space Marines. They were not ordinary men, but genetically enhanced warriors built for conquest. With them, he struck out across the broken world, bringing fire and steel to those who would not kneel. But his was not a war for domination alone. His was a higher purpose. Where his armies marched, ignorance and fear were crushed. The blind faith and primitive idols of the past were cast down, and in their place, he raised reason and order. His goal was not merely to rule Terra, but to unify it, to forge it into a singular, unbreakable force. For he saw beyond this world. Terra was only the beginning. The galaxy itself lay in ruin. He would reclaim it in the name of mankind. His enemies were formidable. The warlord Calagan of Ursh, the tyrannical Cardinal Tang of the Indonsic bloc, and Narthan Doom, the half-mad genius who ruled the Pan-Pacific Empire. Each sought to resist him, but none could stand against the inevitable. One by one, the great warlords fell. The 9th Battle of Zoser in 992 M29 would prove decisive. In the war-ravaged Nordafric conclaves, the Emperor's forces clashed with the armies of Ursh. The battle was unlike any before it. Strange, ephemeral forces twisted reality itself. A psychic storm born of powers few understood. But in the end, Calagan was slain, and the kingdom of Ursh fell. The Emperor's forces became unstoppable, sweeping across Terra like the harvester's scythe through wheat. No warlord, no kingdom, no false god could resist him. Some bent the knee through diplomacy, recognizing that to resist was futile. Others, unwilling to submit, were annihilated. By the time his conquest was complete, Terra was no longer a shattered wasteland of warring tyrants. It was unified, reforged under one banner, the first step in the Emperor's grand design. And from Terra, his gaze turned to the stars. The Imperium of Man was about to be born. The Emperor, in his infinite foresight, knew that to reunite the scattered tribes of humanity and forge a single, unified Imperium, he could not act alone. Though his will was unmatched and his power supreme, the scale of the task demanded that he create generals, proconsuls, sons, who could act in his stead and who could be trusted absolutely. And so, again in secret beneath the Himalayan mountains, he set in motion a project that would shape the fate of the galaxy. From his own divine genetic essence, the Emperor crafted 20 beings of immense power, the Primarchs. Each was a marvel of bioengineering, a perfect fusion of mortal and superhuman, designed to lead armies, govern worlds, and inspire the scattered remnants of mankind to follow the banner of unity. These Primarchs were to be his instruments, his champions in the Great Crusade that would one day scour the stars of ignorance, superstition, and division. But the Imperium was watching. The ruinous powers of chaos, those ancient, malevolent entities that dwell within the warp, had sensed the threat that the Emperor's vision posed. Their dominion over mortal souls was bound to the turmoil and suffering of the material realm. And the Emperor's plan, a galaxy of order, reason, and enlightened rule, would starve them of the power they fed upon. Fearing their impending irrelevance, the Chaos Gods struck. With a confluence of dark sorcery and cunning, they breached the arcane wards protecting the Emperor's clandestine gene laboratory. In a single, catastrophic moment, the gestation capsules housing the unborn Primarchs were wrenched from Terra and hurled across the galaxy. Each capsule fell to a different human-settled world, scattering the Emperor's children to the stars like embers from a dying fire. And in that scattering, several of them were tainted, their destinies subtly warped by the touch of chaos. Though devastated by this loss, the Emperor did not waver. His purpose remained unchanged, even if his methods would now have to shift. The wars that shaped Terra's future were fought in fire and blood, and at the heart of them stood warriors unlike any the world had seen before. The Emperor, in his grand design, had forged many military forces to bring about his vision of unity, but none were as fearsome as the Thunder Warriors. Before them, armies shattered. Before them, mountains crumbled. They were the Emperor's first true super soldiers, known in High Gothic as the Legio Catagus. Built for raw power, they were stronger, faster, and deadlier than even the Space Marines who would come after them. But they were not heroes. They were killers, instruments of war, sculpted in the darkened laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains and within the gene forges of Luna Selenar, where the Space Marines would later embody discipline and purpose. The Thunder Warriors were creatures of destruction, their brutality unchecked, their rage barely contained. Alongside them fought the elite regiments of the early Imperial Army, such as the Geno 5-2 Chiliad and others that would come to be remembered as the Old 100. These soldiers, too, had been enhanced, though not to the same monstrous degree. Designed for resilience and strength, they endured where unaltered men would have perished. And when the Unification Wars ended, it was these regiments that would march alongside the Astartes in the Great Crusade, carrying the Emperor's banner to the stars. But the Thunder Warriors would not. Their fate had been decided long before the final battle of the Unification Wars was even fought. The war for Terra had been an apocalypse. It raged across continents, leveling cities and poisoning the land. Entire mountain ranges were torn asunder. Billions perished. The sheer scale of the conflict would be later dismissed by Imperial scholars as exaggeration. The numbers deemed too vast to be real. But the devastation had been all too real, and it had taken warriors like the Thunder Warriors to win it. According to Imperial records, the last battle was fought at Mount Arat in the ancient kingdom of Urartu. There, the final remnants of opposition to the Emperor were crushed. There, the last of the Thunder Warriors fought and fell. It was said that as the battle ended, Eric Tanaris, the lightning bearer, raised the banner of lightning in victory, proclaiming the unity of Terra before succumbing to his wounds. In this version of history, the Thunder Warriors died as legends, their sacrifice paving the way for a new age under the Emperor's rule. But that was a lie. The Thunder Warriors had not died to a man in glorious battle. They had been exterminated. Their creator, the Emperor, had ordered it. The truth, concealed for 10,000 years, was that the Thunder Warriors were never meant to live beyond the war they had been built to fight. They were not like the Astartes, who would be warriors, leaders, and builders of the Imperium. The Thunder Warriors were weapons, terrible, unstable, and short-lived. Their genetic modifications had cursed them with mental instability and bodies that would inevitably fail. They were not the soldiers of an empire. They were instruments of conquest and nothing more. And so, when the war was won, they were discarded. At first, their numbers simply dwindled. No reinforcements came. No new Thunder Warriors were made. Their ranks thinned from battle and madness, and no one stood to replace them. But that was not enough. The Emperor had built a new future, and there was no place in it for the creatures he had unleashed upon Terra. So he had them purged. The records are unclear on how exactly it happened. Some say that after the Battle of Mount Arat, the Thunder Warriors were led into a final trap, cut down by the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's golden guardians, the only warriors capable of matching them in combat. Others claim that long before the Unification Wars had ended, the Thunder Warriors realized their fate. They saw their short, broken lives as a betrayal and turned against their creator. If this is true, then it was the Custodians and a vanguard of newly created Space Marines, led by the legendary Constantine Valdor, who crushed their rebellion. A few survived, scattered to the shadows of history. But the vast majority of those who had fought for the Emperor, who had killed and bled for him, who had shaped the very foundations of the Imperium itself, died at the hands of their own allies. The Emperor's dream would live, but the Thunder Warriors would be forgotten. Terra was unified. The war had ended. The last banners of the techno-barbarians burned to ash. But the world they left behind was one of ruin. For thousands of years, the Age of Strife had ravaged humanity's homeworld. War unchecked and merciless had twisted it beyond recognition. Cities lay in rubble, their histories lost to the firestorms of nuclear war. The land itself was scarred, poisoned by radiation storms and the lingering traces of viral and alchemical weapons. The people who remained were shadows of what they had once been. Mutilated, malnourished, mutated, degraded by centuries of suffering. The Emperor had not fought merely to claim Terra. He fought to restore it. The conquest had been brutal, but it had only been the beginning. True victory required more than submission. It required rebirth. The Emperor had long foreseen this, and even before the last of his enemies had fallen, he had begun the great work of reconstruction. His first mission was to heal the people themselves. The ravages of war and mutation had left humanity broken. Through the arts of genetic engineering, he sought to return his species to what it had once been, to purge the deformities, the sickness, the decay that had taken root in the human genome over millennia of hardship. The planet's population was stabilized, its people reforged, restored to the purity of their ancestors before the long darkness of old night. But that was not the extent of his vision. From the remnants of his great work, from the genetic material left behind in the wake of abduction, the Emperor began a new project. Using the recovered samples, he cultured thousands of sets of gene seed, engineered strands of DNA that could be implanted into adolescent human males. These gene seeds, when bonded with the human host, would develop into 19 unique sets of transhuman organs, each replicating the gifts of a specific Primarch. From this labor emerged the first of a new breed of warrior. They would be known as the Astartes, the first true Space Marines. These superhuman soldiers would carry on the Emperor's great work. They would become the steel of his blade, the shield of his people, and the burning torch that would lead mankind back into the light. And they would not fight for Terra alone. The Emperor's rule over old Earth was absolute, but his ambitions did not end there. The unification of Terra was merely the first step. Civilization, law, knowledge, these things had been shattered across the stars. Mankind had fallen into anarchy, scattered and divided, preyed upon by Xenos and the horrors of the warp. The Emperor's vision was not merely to reunite humanity, but to rebuild it, to lift it from darkness and forge it anew. A new government was established, one that would serve not only Terra, but in time, the entirety of mankind. Order soon replaced chaos. The shattered remnants of knowledge, buried beneath the rubble of ages, were gathered, preserved, and studied. Grand halls of learning were raised, libraries filled once more. Science, once feared and forgotten, became the foundation of the new age. The Emperor had no use for the superstitions of old night. He would not allow mankind to cower in ignorance ever again. But to reclaim the galaxy, he needed more than warriors. He needed industry. And so, in 712 M30, the Emperor left Terra and set his sights on the red world of Mars. Mars had endured the Age of Strife in its own way. Isolated by the warp storms, the once great colonies of the Mechanicum had become their own civilization, one of machine worship, ancient industry, technological hoarding. The cult Mechanicus had survived where others had fallen, clinging to the remains of lost knowledge, their forge world still brimming with power. The Emperor did not seek to conquer them. He sought an alliance. The Mechanicum possessed the vast manufactories, the Titan legions, the armies of Skitarii and knights that could help build the future he had envisioned. The forges of Mars could construct the weapons and warships needed for his great crusade. The grand campaign that would bring the scattered remnants of humanity back under one rule. In exchange, he made a concession. The Emperor demanded reason and progress, an empire free from superstition. But the cult Mechanicus held fast to its own faith, a belief in the divine nature of the machine. He did not demand that they abandon it. Instead, he granted them autonomy. The Treaty of Mars, known to the Mechanicum as the Treaty of Olympus, cemented their independence. The Forge worlds allowed to operate under their own laws, their worship of the Omnissiah left untouched. With that alliance, the Imperium was truly born. Terra and Mars, the twin pillars of mankind, stood united. The Emperor's War was no longer a struggle for a single world. It was a war for the galaxy, and it was only just beginning. By the time of the Unification Wars, Terra's oceans were little more than remnants of a dying world. Once vast and unbroken, they had been consumed by fire and war. Their waters boiled away in the nuclear infernos of the Age of Strife. The world that had once been blue had turned to dust and ruin. Only one ocean remained, Great Ocean, as it was now called. In the distant past, it had been known as the Pacific, a body of water that once covered nearly a third of Terra's surface. But even it had been scarred beyond recognition. A vast stretch of it had been obliterated, vaporized in an apocalyptic exchange of nuclear fire. Where once waves had rolled unbroken, it was now only wasteland. Scorched void stretching from the Marianas Trench to the shattered remains of Australia, all the way to the frozen wastelands of Antarctica. The Atlantic fared no better. It had once been the domain of ancient navies, the highway of empires. Now, it was mostly gone. What had once bordered the land masses of Europa and the distant Americas had been reduced to scattered remnants. Its southern reaches near the Iberian Peninsula, little more than a memory. And yet, some waters endured. Records speak of a great inland sea that had remained in the heart of Eurasia, in the place where, in ancient days, the Caspian Sea once lay. Though much of Terra had been reshaped by war and devastation, a few bodies of water had survived the madness of old night, lingering like ghosts of a world long lost. These oceans and seas still existed in the early days of the Imperium. During the Horus Heresy in the early 31st millennium, the waters of Terra still lapped against her coasts, diminished, but not yet forgotten. But time would take what war had not. By the 41st millennium, Terra has become something else entirely. The last vestiges of her oceans were gone, consumed by the relentless expansion of the Imperium's heart. The world had transformed into a single boundless city, a vast ecumenopolis, where every inch of land was covered in towering hive cities, spires reaching to the smog-choked sky. No longer did waves crash against her shores. No longer did winds carry the scent of salt across the land. Instead, the great engine of the Imperium toiled on, powered by the ceaseless labor of billions. The Adeptus Terra and their endless ranks of bureaucrats and serfs filled the hives, their work never ending, their lives spent in service to a world that had long since ceased to be a world. The oceans of Terra were gone, and with them, the last traces of the world that had once been called Earth.